Hello, my name is Nancy. I'm 62 years old and I want to share something that changed my life forever. For 35 years, I woke up before sunrise to make my husband's coffee, cleaned up his messes, covered his failures at work, cared for his mother until she passed, and kept our home running perfectly while he made excuses and took everything for granted. Then one day he looked me in the eyes and told me he was replacing me with a 30-year-old woman because, in his words, she does everything better. I felt my chest tighten, my hands tremble, but I refused to cry in front of him. I grabbed my things, picked up my little Maltese Pip, and walked out of the life I had built, carrying something he didn't even know existed, a secret that could change everything. Leaving that house was only the beginning of a journey I never imagined I would take. Alone with just Pip and my courage, I had to face fear, uncertainty, and the shock of betrayal while discovering strength I didn't know I had. What started as heartbreak slowly turned into strategy, resilience, and a plan to reclaim my life and my dignity. But this is only the tip of the story. There are twists, revelations, and moments that will leave you breathless. How did I manage to turn everything around? What did I discover about my husband, his secret, and the life I thought I lost forever? But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your messages and knowing where you're from. Now let's understand how the story really began. I stood frozen in the hallway, the polished wood under my feet reflecting the soft morning light streaming in through the French windows. For a moment, I let myself simply breathe, inhaling the faint scent of Robert's cologne lingering in the air, a smell that once comforted me, but now made my stomach churn. I could hear the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, sounds I had ignored for years because I had been too busy keeping this house alive for him, for us. For 35 years I had woken before dawn, brewing coffee just the way he liked it, listening for the slightest noise of discomfort or need, mopping up mistakes he never owned, holding his mother's hand until her last breath, running this house as if it were a living, breathing thing that depended on me. And now he stood there, scrolling through his phone, oblivious, as though our life together had been nothing more than a decorative arrangement of furniture and polite smiles. I swallowed, fighting the wave of nausea that rose in my chest. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a mix of disbelief, hurt, and an anger so deep it surprised me with its intensity. "For 35 years," I said, my voice trembling, barely above a whisper at first. "I was the one who woke before sunrise to make your coffee, cleaned up your messes, covered your failures at work, cared for your mother until the day she died, and kept this house running while you collected excuses. And now you tell me you're replacing me with a 30-year-old because, in your words, she does everything better?" My words hung in the air like shards of glass, fragile and sharp all at once. Robert didn't look up. He didn't even flinch. "That's right," he said, his voice flat, as though pronouncing some mundane fact about the weather. It hit me like a fist to the chest. 35 years gone in a sentence, erased as if my sacrifices were invisible, irrelevant, meaningless. The betrayal wasn't just in his choice. It was in the utter lack of acknowledgement, the absence of any humanity toward me, toward the life we had shared. I felt tears rising, but I clenched my jaw, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I picked up Pip, my little Maltese, who immediately pressed against my chest, letting out a low growl at Robert. Dogs always know the truth before we do, sensing the moral rot beneath the polished exterior of human behavior. Pip's small, fierce presence gave me courage. I realized I wasn't completely alone. I grabbed my coat and my bag, careful to check that the crumpled piece of paper tucked in my pocket was still there. It was a paternity test I had discovered in Robert's jacket yesterday, revealing a secret child conceived 3 years ago. The evidence was damning, and the implications were devastating for him. If exposed, It would void our prenuptial agreement because of the infidelity clause and could destroy his carefully curated reputation. The thought brought a bittersweet wave of satisfaction. Justice had a way of arriving at the perfect moment, and I was holding it in my hands. I stepped into the driveway, the cool autumn air brushing against my face. My old sedan gleamed faintly under the morning sun, a stark contrast to the pristine elegance of the home I was leaving behind. Pip sat quietly in my lap as I drove, her tiny head nestled under my chin, her fur warm and comforting. The engine hummed, and for a moment I allowed myself to just breathe, to absorb the gravity of the choice I had made. Walking away was never going to be easy, but staying would have been impossible. Staying meant shrinking myself, hiding the truth, and continuing to enable a man who had spent decades underestimating my worth. As I drove, memories flickered like candlelight in my mind. Sunday mornings with pancakes and laughter, quiet evenings of reading together, moments of connection that felt timeless. And yet, those moments had been one-sided, shadows of what should have been mutual care. I had been the caretaker, the quiet engine keeping the household moving, while he collected the credit, the accolades, the sense of self-righteous entitlement. I had loved him in the only way I knew how, fully, patiently, unwaveringly. But love cannot thrive in a vacuum of respect, and respect had long since disappeared. Finally, I reached a stoplight and paused, looking at Pip as she rested her tiny head on my arm. "We're going to be okay," I whispered, though my throat felt raw. She looked up at me, her eyes bright and trusting, and I felt a fragile, flickering flame of hope ignite in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of a life I had been too afraid to claim. The weight of years, of disappointment, of betrayal, pressed down on me. But for the first time, I felt a sense of liberation threading through that heaviness. I clenched the steering wheel, feeling the textured leather against my palms, and allowed myself a single, small smile. I wasn't running away. I was stepping forward. Forward into uncertainty, forward into fear, forward into a future I would shape on my terms, with Pip at my side and a truth in my pocket that could not be ignored. The world outside my window stretched endlessly, roads branching off in every direction. One thing was certain, I would never be powerless again, never invisible again. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling light across the manicured lawns and quiet streets of our suburban paradise, I felt something I hadn't in decades, a quiet, unshakable resolve. I was free, armed not with anger alone, but with strategy, knowledge, and the unwavering belief that I deserved better. The road ahead was mine, and I would walk it with my head held high, my heart open, and Pip by my side, ready to confront whatever came next. The neon sign outside flickered erratically, casting a harsh pink and blue glow through the thin, grimy curtains of the motel room. The hum of the sign, combined with the distant roar of cars on the highway beyond, created a soundtrack that was both lonely and oddly liberating. Inside, the room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale cigarette smoke, a scent that made my stomach tighten for a moment before I shook it off. Pip curled into a small ball on the scratchy bedspread, her tiny body rising and falling with each breath. She looked up at me with confused, trusting eyes, unsure why we were here or what this sudden change meant. My fingers automatically stroked her soft fur, finding comfort in the warmth of her presence, in the rhythm of her breathing, as if we were both silently agreeing that, together, we could face this uncertain night. I sat on the edge of the bed and fished out my wallet, counting the cash carefully. $200. Not a fortune, certainly not enough to rebuild a life, but enough to survive for a little while. My heart thumped in my chest, each beat echoing with a mix of fear, anger, and that fragile thread of hope I hadn't felt in decades. The instinct to panic rose immediately. My fingers itched to call Robert, to plead, to beg for help, but I crushed it down. That was the old me, the version that had sacrificed herself endlessly, who had spent her life smoothing over his mistakes and crises. No, this time I would not reach out for someone who had never truly seen me. Not this time. As I sat there, the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway drew my attention. A young maid pushed a cart laden with fresh towels past our door, her face drawn with exhaustion, her shoulders slumped under the weight of the day. She offered a polite smile as our eyes met. In that brief glance, I saw myself at 22, struggling through invisible burdens with a quiet dignity, and I felt a surge of empathy. Without thinking too much about the impact on my fragile funds, I fished out $20 and slipped it into the small hand she extended. Her eyes widened in surprise, a hint of gratitude shining through the fatigue, and she nodded quickly before moving on. I sank back into the bed, a strange warmth filling me despite the chill of the room. Kindness, I realized, was not something Robert could steal from me. It was mine, and I could wield it quietly, even when the world seemed intent on taking everything else. I glanced around the room, noting the mismatched furniture, the faded wallpaper, the small crack in the mirror that seemed to distort my reflection just slightly. I dug through my purse for my phone and tried to order dog food from a nearby store, only to be met with the cold automated voice, "Transaction declined." My chest tightened as I realized Robert had frozen everything accounts. Credit cards, any semblance of financial autonomy I had once enjoyed. A pang of helplessness clawed at me, and for a moment I closed my eyes, letting tears sting behind my lids. But then I remembered something that had been tucked away, nearly forgotten, like a small ember waiting to ignite. I dug through my emails, scrolling through decades of messages I had mostly ignored over the years. And there it was. I noticed about a personal savings account I had opened long ago, in my name only, funded with modest gifts from my late mother. A secret I had never mentioned to Robert because I had wanted a lifeline in emergencies. My hands trembled slightly as I read the details, my pulse quickening with a mixture of disbelief and cautious excitement. 30 years of steady contributions, untouched and compounded over decades. The numbers on the screen were almost unreal, the quiet reward of a lifetime of small, careful actions, now swelling into a sum that could give me agency again. I felt my shoulders loosen, the tension of the last 24 hours beginning to ebb, replaced by a tentative, fragile sense of possibility. For the first time since leaving home, I allowed myself to imagine that I could fight back, not out of spite alone, but out of a commitment to reclaiming my life, to proving to myself that my worth had never been defined by Robert's opinion, or anyone else's for that matter. I sat down on the floor, Pip climbing into my lap as I gently stroked her head. We shared a simple sandwich I had salvaged from a convenience store, her small, eager nibbles making me smile, despite the bitter tang of fear that lingered at the edges of my thoughts. It was a humble meal, but it felt like a celebration, a quiet affirmation of survival, of companionship, of endurance. The room was small, worn, and unimpressive, yet it had become our sanctuary. The first place I had chosen entirely on my own, the first night that truly belonged to us. As I chewed slowly, my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. I pulled it close, heart thudding in my chest, and my eyes widened as I read the message. The account had just matured. 30 years of compound interest had quietly grown into a sum that gave me enough to begin fighting back, to take deliberate steps toward reclaiming the life Robert had attempted to dominate and control. Relief, mingled with disbelief and a bubbling sense of triumph, washed over me. I laughed softly, a sound that startled even Pip, who tilted her head, ears perked as if to ask, "Is it really true?" "Yes, Pip," I whispered, pressing a kiss to her fur, feeling a deep surge of gratitude and fierce determination. "We're going to be okay. I promise you that." And in that tiny, dimly lit motel room, with the neon lights flickering and the distant hum of the highway pressing against the thin walls, I felt something I hadn't in years, a quiet, firm belief in my own power, a sense of possibility that was mine alone. The fear was still there, yes, but it no longer ruled me. For the first time since Robert's betrayal, I felt the exhilarating, terrifying, and deeply human sensation of hope, the knowledge that even from the most humble and uncertain beginnings, a life could be rebuilt, and a soul could rise again. I pressed my forehead against Pip's soft head and let myself breathe fully, inhaling the faint aroma of her fur and the faintly antiseptic air of the room. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, the path ahead fraught with obstacles. But tonight, in the quiet glow of neon and the warmth of a small, loyal companion, I felt a fleeting but profound sense of triumph. I had survived. I had begun to reclaim myself. And I would continue, one deliberate, courageous step at a time, until my life was entirely my own once more. The diner smelled of stale coffee and the faint tang of grease from the kitchen, a mixture so mundane it was almost comforting. I slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl seat cold beneath me, and opened my phone to continue the research I had begun the night before. Lawyers, specialists in corporate law, estate disputes, people who could help me unravel the tangle Robert had left behind. My eyes traced their websites, their credentials, while I sipped from a cup of bitter coffee, trying to calm the low hum of tension buzzing through my chest. Pip sat quietly at my feet, her small body tucked close, ears flicking at the occasional laugh or clatter of dishes. She was patient, her trust in me unwavering. A steady reminder that even in this uncertain life, some connections could remain unshakable. Then I heard her, sobbing softly, almost hidden behind the scrape of a chair and the low chatter of the other patrons. A young woman at the next table, phone pressed to her ear, voice trembling. I tried not to listen, focusing on the lawyers' profiles, but fragments of her words reached me like sharp arrows. I can't believe this. I just lost my job. He promised me he was rich, but he's drowning in debt. What am I supposed to do? My breath caught. Her voice, familiar now, rang a quiet alarm through my mind. Jessica, Robert's new girlfriend. My chest tightened, a swirl of anger, disbelief, and a strange protective clarity rising within me. She had never actually seen me, had never met the woman whose life she had casually walked into. And yet, here she was, entangled in the chaos Robert had created. I took a slow, steadying breath, trying to quell the sharp sting of anger. This wasn't about her. It never had been. She was a pawn, fragile and scared, a reflection of the ways people can be manipulated when they trust too easily or hope too blindly. I reminded myself that the real target, the one who had betrayed me, was Robert. He was the architect of this disorder, the one who had underestimated me, thought he could erase my existence with a flick of his attention. I folded my hands in my lap, exhaling slowly, letting the heat of my indignation cool into something sharper and more controlled. Her voice broke again, louder this time, spilling over into the diner in a way that made me wince. He needs my help. He needs my signature to sell the house, or the IRS takes everything next week. And now he's got me working as his assistant at the company to cut costs. I thought I could trust him. The words cut through me, but in a strange way they also clarified something profound. The house, the one Robert had counted on as collateral, the very thing that had symbolized decades of my labor, my presence, my sacrifices, was now a leverage point. He was desperate. He was exposed. And with Jessica unknowingly tied to his crumbling empire, the scales were finally tipping in my favor. I felt a small, quiet thrill ripple through me, a sense of agency that I had not experienced since the day I left the house. The anger softened into something almost clinical, a recognition of opportunity, the ability to act decisively, where before I had felt powerless. I watched Jessica cradle the phone against her ear, tears staining her cheeks, her hands shaking slightly. She was unaware of the larger chessboard she had stepped onto, the moves already being made by a woman she did not know existed, yet whose life intersected with hers in ways she could not comprehend. I realized that I could feel empathy for her pain without losing sight of my purpose. She was frightened, yes, but not my adversary. Robert was. And now, for the first time in a long while, I held the upper hand. Pip stirred at my feet, nudging my hand with her cold nose. My fingers curled around her tiny body, pulling her close, and I smiled softly. The first smile in days, unguarded and genuine, the tension around my chest loosening just enough to feel a spark of hope. I reached into my bag, pulled a strip of bacon I had saved from breakfast, and offered it to her under the table. Her little jaws closed around it eagerly, and she wagged her tail, entirely oblivious to the stakes playing out just inches above her head. Watching her, I felt a surge of protective warmth, a reminder that the simplest acts of care could anchor me even as the world shifted beneath my feet. I returned my attention to Jessica, listening as she spoke again into the phone. Unaware of the woman sitting just a few feet away, the one who had built the life Robert was now scrambling to salvage. He promised me he was rich, but he's drowning in debt from tax issues. Her words echoed in my mind like a refrain, and I felt the weight of my power settle around me like armor. I was no longer the victim who had fled a home, clutching the evidence of betrayal in my pocket. I was the one holding the blade, the one capable of turning decades of neglect and deceit into a reckoning that was both precise and inevitable. I traced the edge of the table with my finger, letting my thoughts wander through the possibilities. If Robert needed my signature to survive, if Jessica was now tethered to his financial ruin without knowing it, the dynamic had shifted entirely. The helplessness I had felt in the sterile fluorescent light of the motel, the panic that had pressed against my chest, had been replaced with clarity and determination. I could act, not out of spite, but out of justice, out of a deep, earned understanding of my own value, my own resilience. Pip looked up at me again, eyes bright, tail flicking nervously. I leaned down, pressing my lips to her soft fur, and whispered, "We've got this, Pip. It's our turn now." And in that moment, as the diner buzzed quietly around me, I felt the stirring of triumph, not the loud, reckless kind, but the quiet, profound human sort, born of endurance, intelligence, and courage. Robert's empire had cracks, and I held the map of them in my hands. The game had begun, and for the first time in decades, I was not just surviving, I was leading. A small, private smile curved my lips as I slipped another piece of bacon under the table for Pip. Her tiny, eager teeth met it, and I let myself savor the moment. The world outside the diner's windows could wait. Right now, I held everything I needed. Knowledge, strategy, and the calm, unwavering loyalty of a companion who had been with me through every step of this journey. I was ready. The guillotine was mine to wield. The office smelled faintly of leather, old books, and a hint of tobacco, the comforting aroma of a place that had weathered decades of negotiation, confrontation, and quiet victories. Mr. Henderson's walls were lined with tall shelves, each crammed with thick legal tomes, some with cracked spines and dog-eared pages, others gleaming with the crispness of untouched wisdom. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting stripes across the polished wooden floor. I sat across from him at his wide, imposing desk, Pip curled quietly in a small basket I had brought along, ears twitching at the occasional rustle of papers. I laid the paternity test gently on the desk, spreading it out as if unveiling a piece of fragile glass. Alongside it, I placed financial notes carefully compiled, meticulously detailed, that hinted at hidden payments Robert had made to the child's mother. They were subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion, yet damning when examined with precision. Each notation whispered secrets of tax evasion, of money routed through untraceable accounts, and the quiet deception of a man who had long taken my trust for granted. Henderson's eyes, sharp and unyielding as ever, scanned the documents with barely contained interest. "You've really thought this through," he said, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled, a glimmer of admiration in his gaze. I nodded, feeling a surge of a confidence I hadn't expected to claim yet. The power I had once lent to Robert, the way I had shielded him, smoothed over his mistakes, bailed him out of his own mismanagement, was now being channeled into dismantling him piece by piece. "I don't want a divorce yet," I said quietly, but firmly, my voice resonating with a clarity that surprised even me. "I want to buy his debt." The words felt strange, almost foreign in my mouth, yet there was no hesitation in them. I could feel my pulse quicken, my nerves tense, but the determination beneath it anchored me. For years I had defended him, protected him, quietly bearing the weight of his misdeeds. Now that same intensity, the same resilience, was my weapon. I had always been strong for others. Now I was strong for myself. Henderson raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "A bold strategy," he said, his voice low, carrying the gravitas of decades in courtrooms and negotiation chambers. "But it might just work, Nancy, if Robert believes he's getting help from a foreign investor. Desperate to save his failing company, he won't see the trap until it's too late." I exhaled, a small, controlled breath, letting the weight of the plan settle into my shoulders. The idea of a shell corporation had been floating in my mind for weeks, a quiet ember that needed the right moment to ignite. Now, with Henderson's guidance, it was coming to life. We spent hours together poring over public records, cross-referencing loans and untangling the knots Robert had carefully wrapped around his financial affairs. The house, the place I had called home for 35 years, was a pivotal piece of the puzzle. Personal loans intertwined with business debts, a house held as collateral. A signature forged so cleverly that only someone with intimate knowledge of my handwriting could suspect foul play. Henderson's fingers traced lines on documents, pointing out irregularities, inconsistencies, and potential points of leverage. Each revelation made my heart beat faster, a mixture of vindication and awe. I felt a strange mixture of emotions as we worked, a flush of satisfaction at uncovering the depth of his deception, a pang of sorrow for the years lost, and a quiet exhilaration at reclaiming control. Pip shifted in her basket, nuzzling her head against my leg, grounding me in the reality of the present. The contrast was stark. Here I was, orchestrating a carefully calculated financial maneuver to reclaim justice, while a small, innocent creature reminded me of the simplicity of loyalty, trust, and love. I smiled faintly at her, brushing a strand of hair from my eyes. Somehow, in the midst of spreadsheets, legal jargon, and clandestine planning, there was a profound human element that I couldn't ignore. The resilience of the heart, the drive to right wrongs, and the reclaiming of dignity that had been denied for far too long. After what felt like an eternity, Henderson leaned back, folding his hands together. "Everything's ready for the next step," he said, his tone both approving and cautious. "You're about to change the game entirely, Nancy. And I have to say, it's gratifying to see you harness that fire I remember from years ago. You've always been underestimated. You've always been the one carrying more than your share. Now you're finally wielding it for yourself." I felt a swell of gratitude, not just for his words, but for his unwavering belief in me. It was rare to find allies who truly understood both the legal battlefield and the human toll of betrayal. Henderson was one of the few, and his guidance was invaluable. As I stood to leave, Henderson handed me a thick file, his expression unreadable. "Nancy, you should see this," he said. "Robert put the house up as collateral for a company loan, but he forged your signature on the documents." I felt my stomach knot, a rush of disbelief mingling with vindication. He had overstepped, misjudged, and underestimated every aspect of my presence in his life. The sheer audacity of it stunned me, yet it also fueled the fire that had been quietly simmering inside me for weeks. I cradled the file in my arms as we walked to the elevator, Pip at my side, her small paws clicking softly against the polished floor. The late afternoon light filtered through the office windows, casting long shadows and illuminating the determination etched across my face. I felt a renewed sense of purpose coursing through me. Robert's deception had been blatant, his arrogance complete, and yet it was precisely that hubris that had made him vulnerable. The knowledge, the documentation, the carefully laid plan, all of it coalesced into a force I could finally wield. As I stepped out into the quiet street, the hum of traffic distant in the background, I felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The pieces were in place. The next moves were mine to orchestrate. I inhaled deeply, tasting the crisp air, feeling Pip press against my leg, and allowed myself a small, private smile. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was claiming my agency, my dignity, my life. And in the silence between the passing cars and the rustling leaves, I felt the first true sense of hope in weeks. A hope born not of luck or chance, but of careful preparation, unwavering courage, and the quiet, indomitable strength of a woman who had finally remembered her own worth. The conference room was everything I imagined it would be, sleek, polished, intimidating in its perfection. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows reflected the city skyline in the afternoon sun, a panorama that Robert would have adored boasting about to anyone who would listen. I adjusted the oversized sunglasses that hid my eyes, smoothing the edge of the sleek, dark wig I had invested a small fortune in, and slung my designer bag over my shoulder. Pip nestled quietly inside, her small body barely making a ripple as I moved, a tiny heartbeat of calm beneath the surface of this carefully orchestrated deception. I could feel my pulse quicken as I reviewed the papers tucked neatly inside the bag: contracts, financial statements, and the final document that would transfer 51% of Robert's company to the shell corporation I controlled. Every small detail had been considered, every potential loophole anticipated. My fingers brushed the edge of the folder, a subtle tremor betraying the mix of adrenaline, fear, and anticipation coursing through me. I inhaled deeply, centering myself, feeling Pip's quiet warmth beneath the bag, grounding me. The door opened, and Robert walked in. He carried the weight of arrogance like a suit he had worn too long, but there was also fatigue in his gait, the kind that only comes from desperation. His eyes, scanning the room for validation, didn't recognize me. He had never expected me to show up here, to be this person, this confident, strategic force disguised behind a wig and glasses. I saw him pause briefly, a flicker of confusion in his posture, before his practiced composure returned. I forced myself not to glance at his tie, not to straighten it the way I had done countless times in the past, not to fix the crooked collar I had silently chastised him for over years. Habit was a dangerous thing, and it nearly betrayed me. My hands itched to smooth the fabric, to remind him in the smallest way of my meticulous care. But then I remembered the young woman waiting in our old home, the one who thought she had a place in his life. I pressed my hands against the folder, drawing strength from the contrast between past loyalty and present purpose. That was no longer my role. This time, I was not protecting him. I was reclaiming everything he had taken from me. "Mr. Thompson," I began, my voice measured, deliberate. The words flowed through the sunglasses, through the carefully cultivated persona of an investor's representative. "Thank you for meeting with me. I understand the urgency of your situation, and I believe we can come to an arrangement that satisfies both parties." Robert's eyes flicked toward the documents on the table, scanning briefly, nodding without reading. Desperate for the lifeline he believed I was offering, the recognition that he needed my intervention, yet did not see me, tightened something deep within me. a mixture of triumph and subdued sorrow for the years spent unnoticed, undervalued, and betrayed. I laid the contract in front of him, sliding it across the polished table. In exchange for the bailout funds to cover your company's debts and your personal loans, I continued, keeping my tone calm, neutral, you will sign over 51% of the company to my client. His hands, slightly trembling, moved to sign. He didn't read the fine print. He was too eager, too blinded by the immediate relief of cash, to notice the carefully constructed clauses that would secure my leverage, protect my interests, and ensure justice in the most precise, unassailable way. Pip stirred in my bag, shifting slightly, and I felt the soft pressure of her tiny body against my side. She was quiet, faithful, the perfect little observer of the tension in the room. My lips twitched with a secret smile, reminding myself that the smallest companions can offer the greatest support. Robert's pen scratched against the paper, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent room. I watched him, noting the subtle changes in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed as he reached for the final signature. My own shoulders relaxed just enough to release the tension I had been holding for months. The weight of indignation, sorrow, and determination coalescing into a quiet satisfaction. And then it happened. Pip let out a sharp, sudden bark, the sound cutting through the room like a small, insistent bell. Robert froze instantly, eyes wide, head snapping toward the bag. "That sounds exactly like that rat dog my ex-wife had," he muttered under his breath, a recognition creeping across his face. His arrogance faltered, the mask slipping just for a moment, revealing a flicker of fear and disbelief. I felt a rush of satisfaction, not just in the symbolic justice of the moment, but in the quiet, understated power of survival and loyalty. Pip, my small, loyal companion, had announced our presence in her own way, reminding Robert that the past, no matter how buried, always leaves traces. I leaned back slightly, letting the air of calm authority envelop me. The signature was complete. The deal was done. He had signed over control of his own company without understanding that he had already lost, not through brute force, but through careful, deliberate strategy, through patience, and the knowledge of every subtle misstep he had ever made. I felt a surge of both triumph and poignant reflection. So many years I had been the silent witness to his mistakes, smoothing over his chaos, shielding him from consequences he could not or would not see. Now, the tide had turned. I was not merely the observer anymore. I was the force reshaping the world he had tried to dominate. I pressed a small hand against the bag to calm Pip, feeling her soft warmth and her trusting heartbeat. My gaze swept over Robert one last time, noting the small signs of panic and confusion that betrayed his overconfidence. He had underestimated me, just as he had always underestimated the quiet power of persistence, intelligence, and integrity. My lips curved into a subtle, private smile. The first act in this meticulously planned reclamation had succeeded. As I rose from the chair, gathering the papers and the bag, Pip quietly nestled against my side. I felt a sense of clarity wash over me, a mixture of relief, vindication, and profound purpose. The meeting had ended, but the journey was far from over. Each step I took now was deliberate, informed, and filled with the quiet, unassailable strength of someone who had endured betrayal, embraced her resilience, and was finally reclaiming not just what was hers, but who she had always been meant to be. And as we left the conference room, the hum of the city below, oblivious to the quiet storm we had unleashed, I felt the pulse of possibility in my veins. Pip barked softly again, almost as if in approval, and I whispered to her, "This is only the beginning, little one. We've just started turning the page." In that moment, under the sheen of polished surfaces and the sterile hum of fluorescent light, I knew that the next chapters of my life would be written entirely by my own hands. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store were harsh, unflattering, and unforgiving, casting a cold pallor over the neatly stacked shelves of fruits, vegetables, and canned goods. I pushed my cart slowly through the aisles, Pip trotting obediently at my side, her small leash tangling lightly around my wrist. For the first time in weeks, I was dressed in my regular clothes, comfortable, familiar, ordinary, and it felt liberating. There was no disguise, no pretense, just the quiet dignity of someone reclaiming their life one mundane task at a time. I was examining a display of apples when I heard the sharp, familiar voice of Jessica behind me, a lilt of mockery threaded through it. "Sad, isn't it?" she said, holding her head high, trying to appear superior. "Robert says you were always holding him back." I turned slightly, and there she was, every bit the picture of youthful confidence and arrogance. Her designer bag swung from her shoulder, her expensive heels clicking against the polished linoleum floor. Her eyes darted toward Pip and me, narrowing when she caught sight of my modest shopping list and the coupons I had carefully clipped from the local newspaper. Heat rushed to my cheeks, a flush of indignation I could not entirely hide. I wanted to yell, to throw her words back in her face, to make her feel the sting of the contempt she had just so casually wielded. But I breathed slowly, deliberately, feeling Pip brush against my leg, reminding me of the calm and patience I had cultivated over these weeks. I realized then, with a clarity that steadied me, that a true lady knows the value of silence. Sometimes, the most devastating response is to allow the other person to destroy themselves with their own arrogance. To watch as their hubris carries them toward their own undoing. Jessica's eyes flicked to my coupons again, and I noticed the subtle sneer curling at the corner of her lips. "Using coupons now?" she asked, her tone dripping with disdain. The words barely registered. What truly stopped me in my tracks was the glint of blue at her throat, the unmistakable flash of my mother's vintage sapphire pendant. The one item I had specifically requested Robert to send back to me, the only piece of jewelry I had ever truly loved. My chest tightened, a sharp pang of shock mixed with the familiar fire of indignation. How had it ended up on her neck? That pendant was a piece of my history, my memory, my connection to a woman who had taught me integrity, resilience, and the quiet power of dignity. I forced myself to remain calm, to walk with measured steps through the aisle as if nothing had happened. Pip's small body pressed against my leg, her warmth anchoring me, and I focused on the rhythm of her tiny paws against the floor. The urge to confront Jessica, to demand an explanation, bubbled within me, but I let it pass. This was no longer a matter of personal confrontation. It was strategy, patience, and justice in motion. The legal wheels were turning, carefully and methodically, and there was no need to disrupt the flow with impulsive emotion. Jessica glanced at me again, seemingly oblivious to the silent storm brewing behind my composed exterior. She twisted the pendant in her fingers as she spoke to Robert, laughing lightly at something he said, unaware that every move they made now tightened the noose around their arrogance. I let my gaze linger on them for a moment, the flash of the pendant, the casual contempt in her voice, the unearned confidence in her posture. And then I turned my head, walking away without a word, the sound of Pip's leash jingling gently at my side. Each step was deliberate, a silent assertion that I was in control, that I had survived, and that I was no longer at the mercy of their judgment or their lies. As I reached my car, I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady despite the lingering heat of indignation in my chest. I dialed my lawyer, Henderson, and waited for the familiar voice. "Execute the clause," I said calmly, each word measured and precise. "Call the loan on the house immediately, and look into that necklace. Jessica's his assistant. Maybe she took it from company's storage." There was a pause on the other end, a faint click of recognition, and then the sound of Henderson's assured response. It was happening. Every calculated move, every patient hour of planning, every quiet observation and restraint was beginning to converge into tangible action. I exhaled slowly, leaning against the cool metal of the car, Pip pressing her small body against my legs. The grocery store faded behind me, the fluorescent lights replaced by the warm glow of the late afternoon sun reflecting off the car's hood. I felt a profound sense of clarity, a combination of righteous indignation and quiet satisfaction that comes not from revenge for its own sake, but from the meticulous, deliberate restoration of justice and dignity. In that moment, I realized that humiliation could be a weapon not when wielded with malice, but when endured with grace and used as fuel for thoughtful, deliberate action. Jessica and Robert were blind to the power I now held, not because of physical force, not because of anger, but because of knowledge, strategy, and the unwavering integrity I had carried with me all along. They were about to witness, in ways they could not yet foresee, the full measure of consequences for their arrogance, their deception, and their disregard for the people they had underestimated. I opened the car door, Pip jumping lightly into my arms, her small weight comforting, grounding me in the reality of the life I was creating. I started the engine and exhaled, letting the tension seep from my body, replaced by a steady, determined calm. The pendant would be recovered, the house reclaimed, and justice meticulously delivered, not with a shout, but with the quiet, unstoppable force of preparation, patience, and an unyielding heart. As I pulled away from the parking lot, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Pip licked my hand softly, and I whispered, "We're just getting started, little one. They have no idea what's coming." And in the quiet hum of the engine, with the city moving past us and the sun dipping low on the horizon, I felt the first true sense of empowerment since leaving that house. Humiliation had become a tool, and I was wielding it with precision, grace, and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. The street was quiet except for the low hum of passing cars and the distant chatter of neighbors who had gathered, drawn by curiosity, concern, or the scent of impending drama. My old home loomed across the street, every familiar corner and window suddenly feeling foreign. The polished wood of the door and the manicured lawn, now symbols of a life I had left behind but never truly lost. A sheriff's car sat in the driveway, its official presence a stark reminder that the balance of justice had shifted. My hands gripped the steering wheel for a moment, feeling Pip's tiny body vibrating with anticipation in the passenger seat. I exhaled slowly and reminded myself that every step I had taken had led to this moment. The Shell Corporation, my creation, my quiet revenge, had foreclosed on the house because of Robert's forged signature and the unpaid loans. Henderson had moved heaven and earth to expedite the process, ensuring that nothing could be contested before the legal machinery ground to its inevitable conclusion. And now here I was, across the street from the life that had once defined me, facing the people who had tried to belittle and betray me. Pip tugged gently on her leash as if sensing the gravity of the moment, and I let her guide me toward the curb. My neighbors, standing in small clusters on their lawns and porches, whispered among themselves, their faces a mixture of shock, curiosity, and quiet satisfaction. They had known me as the quiet woman who had endured, who had nurtured the neighborhood children, who had maintained her home and her family with unwavering diligence. They had seen the cracks in Robert's ego and the tension he had caused. But now they were witnessing the transformation of that quiet endurance into deliberate, undeniable power. I stepped out of the car, Pip at my side, her small leash taut in my hand. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint aroma of autumn leaves. I held my head high, each step measured, each movement deliberate. Gone was the shamed ex-wife, the woman dismissed and underestimated. In her place stood someone who had endured betrayal, uncovered deceit, and now commanded justice with grace and authority. I felt a strange calm in my chest, a quiet satisfaction that radiated beneath the simmering heat of tension in the scene before me. Robert's voice rang out before I even reached the sidewalk, sharp and panicked. "No! You can't do this!" he shouted, gesturing wildly toward the officers. His face was red, veins throbbing at his temples, eyes darting from the sheriff to me and back again. Jessica flitted behind him, frantic, stuffing clothing into a suitcase with trembling hands. Her heels clicked against the stone walkway as she moved too quickly, her hair falling across her face, masking the shock and disbelief she could not hide. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes widening in recognition, not just of me, but of the inevitability of the consequences closing in around her. The neighbors were silent now, watching with a fascination that I felt like a tidal wave against my chest. I drew in a deep breath, feeling Pip's soft fur brush against my hand, and I realized I had never felt more present, more grounded, more in alignment with every decision that had brought me here. I was not angry. I was not vengeful in the petty sense. I was deliberate, calm, and utterly in control. Every scream, every frantic motion from Robert and Jessica only confirmed what I already knew. The balance had shifted irrevocably. Robert's eyes found mine. For a fleeting second, the world shrank to just the two of us. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and his chest heaved with the effort of his panic. "Nancy, you have to help me. Talk to them. You always fix things," he pleaded, the desperation in his voice a raw, unpolished sound that struck somewhere deep within me. It was familiar. The old Robert, the man I had once loved, the man I had once protected. But that Robert was gone. The man before me was fragile, reckless, and utterly incapable of seeing the consequences of his own choices until they were forced upon him. I stepped forward, closing the space between us slowly, deliberately. My voice was calm, even, carrying an authority that no one could mistake for weakness. "I'm afraid the new owner is very strict about trespassers," I said, letting the words hang in the crisp air. Pip shifted at my feet, her small body steady and alert, echoing the unwavering resolve I felt inside. The statement was simple, yet it carried the weight of months of planning, years of endurance, and a lifetime of lessons about integrity, patience, and quiet strength. Robert's jaw dropped, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. His hands clenched and unclenched, the veins in his neck straining as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. Jessica froze mid-motion, her suitcase slipping slightly from her grasp, and she looked at me with a mixture of fear, confusion, and grudging recognition. The pendant around her neck glinted in the sunlight, a silent testament to the reach of my awareness and the inevitability of accountability. I let my gaze sweep over them one last time before turning toward the car, Pip following obediently at my side. The neighbors murmured among themselves, some nodding in quiet approval, others simply absorbing the spectacle of justice delivered with grace. I felt a quiet warmth in my chest, a profound satisfaction that did not come from the chaos behind me, but from the knowledge that I had orchestrated it, controlled it, and witnessed it unfold on my own terms. As I opened the car door and slid behind the wheel, Pip leapt gently into my lap, resting her small head against my arm. I started the engine, the low purr of the motor grounding me in the present, carrying me away from the past and into the life I was reclaiming piece by piece. I realized then that power did not always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it was quiet, deliberate, and utterly undeniable, like the tide slowly reshaping the shoreline. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a last glimpse of Robert and Jessica standing on the lawn, their faces pale and stunned. I allowed a small, private smile to curve my lips. The eviction was not just a legal act. It was a symbolic reclaiming of my dignity, my autonomy, and my ability to shape my life without fear or compromise. Pip barked softly, as if sharing in my satisfaction, and I whispered to her, "This is our moment, little one, and it's only the beginning." The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the chaos, the panic, and the stunned disbelief. The house, once a symbol of control and suppression, now stood as a monument to deliberate justice. I exhaled, feeling the tension melt from my shoulders, replaced by a sense of calm, purpose, and the profound freedom of someone who had endured, survived, and was finally stepping into her own. The sun reflected off the windows, bathing the street in golden light, and I knew that whatever came next, I would face it with clarity, strength, and unwavering grace. The gala was alive with the soft murmur of conversation, the delicate clinking of glasses, and the low hum of an orchestra playing a light, sophisticated tune in the background. The ballroom shimmered under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, reflecting off polished floors and satin gowns, their colors a cascade of jewel tones. I paused at the entrance for a moment, taking a deep breath, letting the aroma of expensive perfume, rich hors d'oeuvres, and polished leather wash over me. Pip, tucked securely in a small, elegant carrier that complemented my ensemble, stirred slightly, her dark eyes watching the crowd with curious awareness. I felt the weight of all I had endured over the past months, the quiet planning, the sleepless nights, the nervous anticipation, and the thrill of finally reclaiming agency over my life. My red gown clung to me in all the right places, flowing effortlessly at the hem, a symbol not just of elegance, but of transformation. I had sold some company assets through the Shell Corporation to fund this new life, and as I stepped forward, I realized I looked 10 years younger, but more importantly, I felt it. There was a lightness in my chest, a pulse of confidence that came from having survived betrayal and humiliation, and having emerged not only unbroken, but empowered. As I moved through the crowd, old friends and acquaintances, faces that had once been distant or dismissive, looked up in astonishment. Some of them had ignored my calls after the split, avoided my eyes at social gatherings, or whispered behind their hands when I passed. Now, they paused, startled by the grace and assurance in my stride. I offered soft smiles and gentle nods, careful not to overplay my triumph. It wasn't arrogance I wanted them to see. It was resilience, a quiet assertion that I had endured the storm and emerged stronger. Unshaken and fully aware of my worth, Robert stood at the far end of the room, behind a polished podium, trying desperately to maintain the appearance of poise. He smiled too widely, gesturing animatedly, trying to convince the gathered crowd that the merger he had orchestrated was a resounding success. The words felt hollow, the effort palpable. I watched him, noting the subtle tremor in his hands, the slight perspiration at his temples, the cracks in the facade he worked so hard to maintain. Every gesture, every strained smile, was a testament to how far he had fallen from the confident, controlling man I had once known. I paused near a table, letting Pip peek from her carrier, her small nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. I greeted a few old colleagues, exchanging polite pleasantries, their eyes wide, their voices slightly quivering as they tried to reconcile the memory of the woman they had dismissed with the woman now standing before them. Each interaction reinforced a truth that was slowly settling into my bones. Power was not about wealth, appearance, or manipulation. It was about surviving, reclaiming, and embodying the integrity and confidence that cannot be stolen. Then, the lights dimmed slightly, and Robert cleared his throat, the microphone squeaking faintly as he adjusted it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice attempting authority but carrying the tension of desperation, "I'd like to introduce the silent partner who has graciously helped save the company through these turbulent times." He gestured toward the curtain at the far side of the stage. A spotlight flared, illuminating the folds of red fabric as the audience turned expectantly toward it. I felt my heart rate pick up, a rush of exhilaration and controlled anticipation coursing through me. No disguise, no pretense. This was the culmination of every careful step I had taken. I stepped out from behind the curtain, the audience collectively shifting in their seats as murmurs spread through the room. Pip peeked from her carrier, eyes alert, sensing the energy in the room. Her small presence a grounding force against the flutter of adrenaline in my chest. Robert's hand tightened around the microphone, his knuckles white, as he took a step back, unable to hide the shock that had spread across his face. The audience fell into a stunned silence, their eyes following me as I moved to the podium. His whispered, incredulous, almost pleading, "You?" barely carried over the soft buzz of anticipation that had built in the room. I picked up the microphone, feeling its weight in my hand, and smiled. Not a triumphal, gloating smile, but a smile that conveyed calm authority, measured control, and the quiet assurance of someone who had endured and now commanded her own destiny. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I'm not the partner. I'm the owner, and I'm making some personnel changes." The words hung in the air, undeniable, each syllable a precise strike of truth. The crowd was frozen, their whispers stilled as eyes turned from me to Robert and back again. He staggered slightly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, grasping for words that would not come. I could feel the room holding its collective breath, the tension between past deceit and present authority crackling like static electricity. Every glance, every subtle shift of posture reinforced the power of what I had accomplished, not through malice, but through deliberate, intelligent action and the courage to embrace my worth. Pip nudged my hand, her small presence reminding me that I was not alone, that loyalty and companionship were forces as powerful as any legal or financial maneuver. I let my gaze sweep across the audience, meeting the astonished eyes of those who had doubted me. The unmasked fear on Robert's face, and the subtle embarrassment creeping across Jessica's features. It was not vindictive. It was righteous, deliberate, and transformative. For the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of completion, not in the sense of revenge fulfilled, but in the quiet, unwavering affirmation that I had reclaimed control over my life, that I had faced betrayal, humiliation, and loss, and emerged fully sovereign in my own power. I straightened my spine, allowed my shoulders to relax, and let the confidence radiate naturally from within. The orchestra softened. The murmurs continued, but in that moment, the world had shifted irrevocably, and I was no longer a woman at the mercy of circumstance. I was a woman who had survived, triumphed, and stepped fully into her own light. The moment the ballroom doors closed behind me, the muffled roar of the crowd faded like a distant tide. Only the echo of my heels remained, tapping steadily against the polished hallway floor. Pip's soft weight rested securely in my arms as I approached Robert's office. I could hear him before I even opened the door, something frantic, a rustling, a glass clinking against a bottle. When I stepped inside, he was standing behind his desk, shoulders trembling as he poured amber liquid into a heavy-cut crystal glass. The bottle shook in his hand, the stream splashing over the rim before he caught himself. The office smelled of expensive cologne, old leather, and panic. He didn't look up right away. Maybe he couldn't. When he finally did, his eyes were wide, glossy, pupils blown like someone who'd just awakened into a nightmare. "How?" he whispered. Not a shout, just a broken, startled sound that barely made it across the room. He sank into the leather chair he'd once used to make decisions that shaped entire teams of people. Decisions he'd made without consulting me, without considering the impact beyond his own ego. Now the same chair seemed too big for him, swallowing him whole. I stood across from him, calm, steady, the warmth of Pip pressed lightly against my ribs. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet was enough. "You want the truth?" I asked softly. He laughed, a small, humorless exhale, and nodded. So I laid it all out. Slowly, clearly, without cruelty, but with precision. "The paternity test," I began. His face went pale instantly, as if someone had pulled a plug beneath his skin and drained the color from it. "Not mine, not my doing, but the aftermath? The unreported payments you made to keep it quiet? The cash withdrawals? The hidden transfers? All of that shows intent to conceal income. And that," I said gently, is textbook tax fraud. He swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening as he reached for his glass. His hand shook so badly the ice clinked again. I continued. The forged signature on the loan documents. That's a felony. A serious one. My voice did not waver. Not once. You put my name on something illegal. You tied me to your mess. You gambled with my future when you thought I'd just roll over and let you. He pressed his fingers to his forehead, eyes squeezing shut, groaning into the heel of his palm like he could physically push the truth away. And the shell company? I said, watching him as he lowered his hand. The one you signed 51% of your business over to? That shell corporation owns you, Robert. You agreed to everything without reading the fine print. You were desperate. And I stopped being desperate a long time ago. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Robert stared at me like he was seeing someone he'd never truly known, someone he had underestimated so profoundly that he could not comprehend how completely he had lost. "You planned this," he whispered, voice splintered. "All of it." I took a breath. Pip shifted slightly, her small head pressing into the crook of my elbow. "I didn't do this to hurt you, Robert." His gaze flickered upward, confusion swimming in the storm of his expression. "I did this to stop you from hurting anyone else ever again." There was no tremble in my voice. No bitterness. Just truth. The kind of truth that stands even when everything else collapses. He let out a long, uneven breath. "So what? What happens to me now?" I walked closer, each step measured, controlled. I set Pip gently on the floor and she sniffed delicately at the edge of the rug before settling onto my foot like a tiny, living anchor. "You can keep your job," I said. His brows shot up, hope sparking and dying in the same instant. "As a junior consultant." He blinked, stunned, his mouth parting before he managed a strained junior consultant. "You'll report to me," I continued, my tone even. "Everything you do goes through me, every project, every client, every public appearance." His chest rose with a sharp inhale humiliation, pride shattering in slow motion. "And Jessica?" he asked, voice barely audible. "I fired her 10 minutes ago," I said simply, "for theft. She admitted taking my mother's necklace from your office safe during the eviction chaos." I held out my hand, palm steady. "Oh, and I want it back." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, with the stiffness of resignation settling into his bones, he reached into his pocket. His fingers trembled as he pulled out the small velvet pouch creased. Warm from being held, the drawstring slightly tangled as if someone had clutched it too tightly in panic. He set it in my hand without a word. I opened it slowly, and there it was, my mother's sapphire pendant. Its deep blue stone shimmered under the office lights, catching the faintest glint of gold from its delicate frame. Something in my chest tightened, not with pain, but with a kind of bittersweet relief. He watched me, hollowed out, defeated. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. The question came out raw, stripped of arrogance or entitlement. Just a man finally realizing he had no idea who I had become. I picked up Pip, her tiny body warm against my heart. I walked toward the door, letting the familiar weight of the necklace rest securely in my hand. I didn't look back until I reached the threshold. When I did, my voice was soft, almost tender, but firm with the certainty I had reclaimed piece by piece. Whatever I want. And then I stepped out, closing the door quietly, decisively behind me. The morning air was warm, tinged with salt and the gentle hum of the ocean waves breaking rhythmically on the shore. I sat on the wide porch of my new beach house in Florida, the wood beneath me still smelling faintly of fresh varnish, and watched the sun paint streaks of gold across the horizon. Pip lay beside my chair at first, but the moment a gull cried out overhead, she bounded up into my lap, her small paws digging into my arms, tail wagging so hard it almost knocked over my coffee cup. I laughed softly, feeling a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying lift from my chest. This was my sanctuary, my hard-won peace, the tangible reward for courage, patience, and unwavering self-respect. In front of me sat a checkbook, a small but powerful symbol of agency and generosity. My pen hovered for a brief moment, and I exhaled, letting the gentle rhythm of the waves calm the fluttering nervousness in my stomach. I was writing a check to a women's shelter, a place that would benefit from the financial security I had reclaimed through deliberate action and long-planned strategy. It wasn't just a gift of money. It was a testament to the life I had built, a life that could now lift others, that could make a difference beyond my own story of survival. Pip nuzzled the pen in my hand as if sharing in the gravity of the act, and I smiled down at her, feeling a bond deeper than words could capture. Robert's life, by contrast, had shrunk in scope and in consequence. Within a week, his fragile ego had driven him to quit, unwilling to face the embarrassment of being overpowered not by a rival or a board of directors, but by the woman he had thought incapable of asserting herself. He was now living in a small, cramped apartment, endlessly negotiating with the IRS and entangled in the difficult logistics of his secret child's care. I had watched the events unfold from a place of calm detachment, understanding that his downfall was not a celebration for me. It was a necessary closure, a natural consequence of his repeated disregard for integrity and honesty. I shifted slightly in my chair, feeling the worn wood press into my back and the warmth of the sun on my face, letting the gentle breeze carry away the residual tension from years of struggle. 6 months had passed since the eviction, 6 months of quiet growth, deliberate planning, and the subtle joy of reclaiming power in a way that was graceful, measured, and meaningful. I had sold the old house, using the proceeds to secure this new life, one that reflected my values, my independence, and my capacity to build rather than simply endure. I glanced at Pip, who now rested her head against my arm, eyes closed, content in a way that mirrored my own satisfaction and peace. Looking out over the vast expanse of the ocean, I felt a realization settle deep in my chest, one that had been months in the making but crystallized fully in this serene moment for 35 years. I had measured my worth in endurance, in how much I could suffer, how much I could sacrifice, how much I could endure silently while others took advantage. That measure had never been mine. It had been imposed by expectation, by society, by the selfishness of those around me. Now, watching the sun rise over a horizon that seemed endless and brimming with possibility, I understood clearly that my value was not in endurance, it was in creation. My value was in building a life on my terms, in fostering growth, in helping others, and in embracing the joy, beauty, and freedom that I had fought so hard to claim. The sound of waves mingled with the distant cry of gulls, and I took a slow sip of my coffee, hot and perfectly brewed just the way I liked it, without compromise, without the silent satisfaction of having to cater to someone else's taste. Pip barked lightly at a gull wheeling overhead, her tiny voice carrying across the sand, and I laughed aloud. "You know what, Pip?" I said, speaking to her but really to myself, to the universe, to the life that I had reclaimed. "I think we're going to be just fine." The words felt like a benediction, a final seal on a chapter of struggle, and the confident opening of a chapter of freedom, strength, and joy. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the soft sway of the porch under me. Pip nestled in my lap and let the sunlight wash over my face, warming every ache that had once been carried quietly in my heart. For the first time in my life, the sunrise seemed to rise for me alone, a private ceremony marking the triumph of patience, courage, and resilience. I thought of the journey, the motel nights with Pip curled beside me, the careful planning, the discreet victories, the moments of rage and sadness that had shaped me, but never defined me. Every hardship had been a teacher, every betrayal a lesson, every quiet victory a step toward reclaiming my identity. And in that light, I understood that my life, my true life, was finally my own. Not because I had defeated Robert, not because I had orchestrated justice, but because I had chosen myself at last. In every small decision, every act of courage, and every expression of care, whether for Pip, for myself, or for others who needed help, my heart swelled with the realization that freedom, dignity, and joy were not prizes to be won, they were states to be claimed, daily, with intent and integrity. The seagulls cried again, the waves murmured, and Pip barked one more time at a curious shadow on the sand. I smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face, the salty wind tangling in it gently. I reached over and patted Pip's head, feeling the soft press of her fur against my fingers. "We did it, little one," I whispered. "We really did." And as the sun rose higher, flooding the porch, the sand, and the endless horizon with golden light, I truly knew, that this was only the beginning. For anyone who has faced betrayal, injustice, or heartbreak, remember, the strength to rebuild, to reclaim, and to thrive exists within you. And sometimes, the most profound victories are not loud or dramatic. They are quiet, tender, and filled with the satisfaction of knowing that your life is finally your own. If you enjoyed this story, its emotional journey, and the lessons of resilience, courage, and self-worth, make sure to subscribe to our channel to follow more stories of empowerment, triumph, and heartfelt human experience. There's so much more to explore, and your journey to inspiration continues here.